Michael, let's pick up discussion with you, because while we've had many African markets proving over the last several years that they are an attractive investment destination, and this despite the challenges that have been presented by the global economic crisis overall, when it comes to competitiveness on the global stage, that's still being brought to question. How do we rank or rate on that competitiveness scale?
Well, it's a complex question because there are a number of factors that go into competitiveness. And, you know, when you look at the international ratings, Africa is still very much in the middle to, third quartile of competitiveness. And when you actually look at why, it's infrastructure capability, it's the depth of education standards and talented workforce pool, and it comes to, energy shortages, are the sort of three issues that come up, which I think ultimately need to be addressed. But as I said to you, I think every international investor I speak to sees the potential in Africa. They're looking at the trade flows. They realise the Western markets are going to be deleveraging and quite constrained over a period of time. They're seeing the rising middle class. They're seeing the population strength. They're seeing the importance of securing energy and food resources going forward, of which Africa has an enormous competitive edge. So they know it's a market they have to be in, and they're now really trying to work out what is the best way of accessing that marketplace.
Tonya, let's look at impediments to competitiveness, because some of those impediments that Michael has highlighted contributes to the cost factor of doing business here as well. And infrastructure developments and maintenance crops up time and time again as a major challenge and hindrance to doing business on the continent, as well as the high cost when that infrastructure is accessible. How much of a constraint has it been to growth for your business?
Well, it's been a massive constraint. It's funny that investors and entrepreneurs tend to see that these things are absolutely necessary, but for some reason that beats understanding, most governments don't tend to see it that way. And so investment in areas that should increase competition is lacking. And this is something that must be addressed very quickly by the government. Now, private institutions coming in and making massive investments in infrastructure is something that you started seeing happening with the port reforms in Nigeria. We started doing some toll roads, which are opening up areas of business. And once this starts happening, you see that there's a total change in the idea of how businesses operate and how they perform. But it's difficult for private investments to come into these areas where traditionally the governments have done them. And so you see governments holding on to infrastructure developments to the detriment of an improved economy.
Yeah. Well, Nick, when do you see us getting to a point, I know this is a tough question, but when do you see us getting to a point when infrastructure investment is supportive of Africa being open for business? And what's your assessment of the strides that we are making?
Well, there are key types of infrastructure. One mustn't just think of rail and road and ports and so on. There's the telecommunications infrastructure, which is vital. There's the financial investment infrastructure that is absolutely central. These are the main arteries of infrastructure. It's coming, and I think if you look at the data, it shows that there's increasing investment in these areas. But I want to talk for a minute about the competitiveness mindset. When I go to Lagos, I'm in one of the hardest working, toughest environments that is full of more energy than most other big cities like Shanghai, even a Bangalore or a Manhattan. It just has no infrastructure. If you lift Nigerians into infrastructure, we're going to see unbelievable entrepreneurship. That applies in many countries. I see a similar thing in East Africa where people are ready to run. So the question that I keep coming back to is the role of the middle class. The role of business is to excite the nation about the size of the opportunity that lies ahead. And I think we need to talk much more as business about this competitive spirit. The fact that if government is behind us, we need to, as you were saying about Europe, get a little ahead of government and push very hard for this. The way to do this is not in secret passages. It's in the public debate. I measure competitiveness by the ratio of sports pages to business pages in every country I go. And if there are more than 2 sports pages to 1 business page, you are not in a competitive country. So it's a good test to go and look at. And we as business can have a lot to do with engaging society about business and economics much more aggressively than we have.
Oh, we're going to have many more people counting the pages on the newspapers. Maria, when it comes to financial resources, I mean, lack of access to capital often crops up as that major reason as to why more significant stride is not being made. There's a huge funding gap, and we have PPPs more and more looked at to close that gap. But just what kind of a challenge are we facing here, and how risky a lend is it towards long-term projects like infrastructure projects?
Well, I think Nick has put hit the nail on the head. You know, we always talk about infrastructure as rail and port and pipelines, and of course that's an important part of infrastructure. But as he says, an equally important part of infrastructure is making sure that you've got telecoms and financial infrastructure. You know, having financial markets and functioning financial markets is critical to economic development, and it's a fundamental way of being able to lend and to assess risk. And I think government has an important role to ensure that you are able to have a functioning financial sector, that you've got the regulatory framework, the rules of the game need to be known and understood, and then, you know, then banks and a wider set of financial markets can function. And I think we're starting to get that right in most countries on this continent, and that allows, you know, that allows for a ease of lending, that allows banks and financial institutions to assess risk, to roll out financial instruments, to understand what products you can put into a market that will allow you to do PPPs, to engage with public sector institutions to get the right PPPs in place, to understand our risk in a public-private partnership is going to be established and distributed, to make sure that the contract actually is going to be there and going to be honored, to know how pricing is going to work in a public-private partnership, and that the contract, once you're going to enter into it, is going to stand the test of time. Because all of those are important if you want to have a functioning financial market.
Absolutely.
So it's those things that are really important in financial infrastructure.
Before we get off the topic of financial infrastructure, I mean, we've seen the G20 leading the drive to change banking regulation around the globe. What's your view on the kind of changes that have been proposed, and what kind of impact do you see it having on banking on the continent and ultimately access to capital?
Well, I think we've, as I said earlier, we've gone through a lot of change in the last few years, and a lot of that was very necessary. I mean, we've gone through a massive financial crisis. A lot of it, as financial institutions and as banks, we've had to take a long, hard look and understand that we've played a role in it. And I think good banks need solid, good, strong regulation in order to function. I think we also have to understand that we regulation needs to, we need to stabilize the regulatory environment, and we need to get down to implementing the regulation that we have. Mm-hmm. And I think regulators also need to understand that that there comes a point where regulation has to be stabilized. That, you know, ongoing changes in the regulatory environment need to take into consideration the fact that that they do impact the decision-making process. That if you are going to raise capital levels very, very far, you're going to impact what banks can do, how much they can lend. And that in itself impacts economic growth and opportunity. So there is a balance in regulation too, like in everything in life.
Well, Michael, I mean, if we explore possible models that could be leveraged off here, let's for a moment explore PPPs. I mean, how do you make both the public and private sectors work for a common good?
Well, I think you've got to establish what your common object is at the end of the day, and make sure that the private sector investor can see a long-term guaranteed financial return, that there's a proper risk allocation between the two parties in these types of transactions, and that everyone understands what their expectations are going into this transaction. Because inevitably gets down the track, a problem occurs, and the blame game starts between the two of them. Whereas the best PPPs are those which are spelled out up front as to what your various obligations and responsibilities are, which are very clear and mandated. And these are models which have now been well and truly tried around the world. So there are any number of good case studies and good examples we can quote from other jurisdictions where these have been successful.
Tanya, when it comes to these relationships, it seems that trust is the missing ingredient, from the relationship between African governments and the private sector. How can we bridge this gap?
Well, you're absolutely right there. One of the things that the governments tend to believe is that every private investor that is coming in is trying to milk as much as they can out of the infrastructure they've taken over. Now, I agree with Michael, I think, that one of the things that we have to do is find a middle ground. Right from the beginning, there has to be an absolute and very explicit framework as to what expectations are. I have been personally involved in some of the PPP projects in the power sector, and it's just come to a near standstill because the expectations of the government is totally different from the expectations of the private investor, which on the other hand is different from the expectations of the general public. Now there has to be education. People have to know upfront exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they intend to do it. And then as you move along, problems will come up, definitely. But once those problems come up, everyone knows from being pre-warned as to how they will tackle it and how they will balance it. So there is an issue of trust, and that trust can only be dealt with when people speak and people lay out beforehand, no secrecy, everything upfront on the table, no backhand deals, no behind-the-scene negotiations, everything upfront and clear. And I think that's what's lacking. There's a lot of secrecy in everything that we do.
Nick, we've been exploring public-private collaboration. Is it more beneficial for business where the state plays a stronger hand, or should the state remain just as a provider of an efficient regulatory system that is supportive of business and allows business to thrive?
I think it very much depends on where you are. If we look at Rwanda in the last few years, which has really been a fantastic case study of a turnaround, authoritarian in a way, they've cleaned up the streets, the state plays an active role in that economy. I think one of the extraordinary things about the world we're in at the moment is there's so many models. China's a state-led economy. Singapore is a co-planned economy. I don't think you can have one model in Africa. South Africa is a very sophisticated, complex economy, and we clearly don't have very good levels of coordination. We've got a very strong private sector. Nigeria, as we were hearing, really has a job of work to do to bring this together and create enough trust, given its long history. Kenya, I think, is a little better, although it also has very major problems. So I think it very much depends on where we are. The broad philosophy has to be going back to the earlier point. It's the market. We must get markets functioning, and we must push for them to function. And we in business, I would argue, have to take the leadership role in trying to create the pressure in society to ensure that our political debate is driven by the potential of our economy. Someone once said that the opportunity of a lifetime has got to be seized in the lifetime of the opportunity. And this will not go on forever, and we do have a window. And a lot of it, as you hear, is about governance. Yeah. But that governance rests on assent, the consent of people. And the consent of politics in Africa is still developing. And I come to the middle class. Our best people don't live in Africa. Mm-hmm. We need to bring them back as India brought them back. And so the whole debate about making a country attractive and getting the right governance is absolutely essential. And here, public education, and I don't mean university or school education, I mean just public debate and fostering it across the boundaries so that you can't do these deals in some countries where you lock in rooms and do specialties. A last thought from me about this. We need to strengthen economic diplomacy. When governments or multinationals meet with our governments, our African governments, they're meeting often people not as well prepared, and we must strengthen the education system for negotiation from a point of view of the country's interests, to have good economic diplomacy, to look after our interests. One of my fears about all this is we'll end up with Africa owned by multinationals again. We don't want that. We must develop local business. To do that, you have to have skilled government officials and skilled business people in a partnership.
And of course, that brings us back to another factor that contributes to competitiveness, and that your labor force and skill set that your country has to boast. Of course, at this point, let's open up once again to the audience. We've got roughly 10 minutes or so for audience questions. So let's keep the questions short and to the point, and let us know who that question is being directed to as well.
Thank you. My name is Tichaona Makonese. I'm from ABSA. We touched briefly on my question. I was worrying it was just about to be usurped there, Nick. One of the factors that leads to professionals leaving, or possibly nascent professionals, people that are coming up, is the desire to get a quality education. And that's why I think a lot of African professionals are actually not in Africa. Now, I think South Africa is unique in that, well, possibly not entirely, but I think South Africa has got a lot of very good educational institutions that a lot of people come from various other African countries to engage in, to be able to get an education out of these institutions. And a lot of those people do not return. Now, from where you're sitting, running GIBS, which I think is a fine institution, how involved are you in possibly getting other African countries to also have quality institutions that offer business education, that, you know, people coming out of high school within Africa, for instance, someone doing their O-levels or their A-levels in a place like Zimbabwe or in a place like Zambia feels, I don't have to go to South Africa to learn, because I think that's a vital point, and that's why people leave. You see, I think previously we had a lot of good institutions. I know Makerere in Uganda was very, very accredited, a place that a lot of people wanted to go to. That's possibly not the case. And I say that myself because I was in high school with quite a few Ugandans in Zimbabwe. So how do we, you know, what can we do as a continent? Because I think that's important. When you look at the rankings of business schools, I think all the business schools that are ranked in the top 100 at the moment are all within South Africa. There is nothing on the continent. So all these young, bright, ambitious guys coming through the education systems in Africa, whatever still remains of them, will still feel the need that, look, if I need to get an education, I'm going to cross the ocean, I'm possibly going to go to South Africa, and they'll never return.
Well, we've been working quite hard on this for the last 10 years. There's an African Association of Business Schools. There's some good business schools in Africa that are not South African. Lagos Business School, Strathmore in Kenya, in Ghana. So they're being strengthened, and foreign business schools are paying more and more attention. So I think this is a good area. We've built a network, and we work together extensively to ensure that the standards are moving up and that we can help each other. So in the business school sector, I think we're quite good. The main issue is schooling. You know, if you don't have good maths and you don't have good science, you can be as educated as you like. You are not a globally employable individual. And we've got to turn our schooling system around and our university, public university system. Yeah. So I thank you for the question. There's lots to do.
Well, just to remind you, please can you keep your answers short and to the point? We've got quite a few that we've got to get through. Next question from the audience.
Yes, good morning. My name is Simon Harford from Actis. We're an active investor for many decades across Africa. Can I get us a bit more detailed into a topic that hasn't been raised much, which is the ethics of doing business? So it's not just doing business, it's doing business responsibly. And particularly a question, if I may, for KPMG and GIBS. I think your organizations have got crucial roles to play to be a force for good across the continent and with the business school network across the continent, because the biggest culprit is often the private sector. If you look at corruption, it is the private sector that's often doing the bribing. And if you look at things like environmental standards in a continent where we have to set our own standards often because they're not often set for us. So could you please comment on whether we have enough focus on this? What can be done to raise the profile of not just doing business, but doing business responsibly?
Well, thank you for the question, because I actually do think that our organisations have a very positive role to play here. I think you'll find that most responsible multinational businesses have a very strong code of conduct and ethical behaviour as to what they will or won't do. And I think they're becoming much more disciplined around actually enforcing those, particularly in remote locations as they would find in Africa. The other thing I'd say to you is it's now incumbent upon us. We now have reporting obligations to, say, the UK government, to the US government, to basically highlight issues where we see corruption or we see facilitation payments. And so there's now positive statutory duties on us to declare this. And then our own internal quality controls are now, we go through a rigorous client selection process. And if we in any way don't see a client who's prepared to actually accept or tolerate our standards, then we simply won't do business or lend our brand name to those organisations. And this is a huge issue, can I say, in China at the moment, as we are now starting to see the private sector start to emerge and become much more entrepreneurial. You would have seen recently the whole issue around backdoor listings in China, which has really, I think, highlighted the need to basically impose strong governance and strong standards of conduct in these emerging economies. And if these people want to raise capital and they want access to marketplace, they need to understand that this is going to be a critical success factor going forward.
Okay.
Can I just comment on that? We've signed up to the PRME, which is the UN Initiative on Ethics. All of our students write and develop their own personal ethical charter. But it really just scratches the surface. The question is enforcement, especially by government, in reviewing the regulatory environment and following up on corruption cases and prosecuting. So the government plays a very critical role in setting the climate of corruption or not. And the private sector, and I think you're right, multinationals set high standards, but domestic companies really have to set the pace in this area. And we don't see enough of that, I don't think, in general.
Yeah, I want to just bring Tonya into the conversation at this point, Tonya, because you know, this perception that's been widely held is corruption in Nigeria. It's become synonymous to an extent with Nigeria. To what extent are you seeing change happening on your end?
Okay, now from the private sector perspective, one of the things that I've seen is that governance has become more and more important because a lot of private sector companies have to get funding from banks, have to get funding from international companies to do some of the businesses that they do. And most of these companies require, especially when they go into joint ventures, the Local Content Act, for example, sees that international companies must partner with local companies to do business. Now, where you see that happening, one of the primary things that you find out is that a code of conduct, good governance mechanism must be put in place. And so I'm seeing this definitely, that within the sector of within the private sector, that the issues of corruption, direct facilitation has gone down and is going down. I also agree that a lot more has to be done as far as the enforcement of corrupt practices is concerned. That's not as high as I think it should be, and I believe that more will be done in that aspect. But definitely good governance and regulation is coming into the sector, which is helping.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, my name is... My name is Mbi Mbappe, and I'm from Uniman Associates International. My question is directed to Maria. What's the paradigm, or what's the thinking around the banking environment in shifting the paradigm from traditional banking models to face the opportunities that are on the continent?
Well, we certainly, as ABSA and as Barclays in particular, we've got a very big footprint in Africa. And one of the things we have done now is looking at and taking advantage of the opportunity on the African continent. And we are just as positive and as excited about Africa as you have heard from all the panelists and the discussion we've been having this morning. So we are integrating operationally and managerially our business across Africa to take advantage of that opportunity. And we're doing it across the board, from our corporate and investment banking business, our retail business, and our bank assurance business. We're doing that both in terms of our people, our products, and our global business. I mean, most of our global clients in the Barclays Group are asking us every day, what are we doing in Africa? How can we service them in Africa? And it's actually that client push globally that has got us to ask ourselves a lot of questions about what kind of business we're doing in Africa, how we're doing it, can we do it better, can we service them better globally by servicing them better on this continent, given the business that they want to do on the continent. So that's been the mind shift within our own business in relation to the business that we do in Africa. In some countries, we've been in for almost 100 years. And so it's not like we haven't been in Africa before. We have been in Africa for a very long time. It's just been that mindset change about the opportunity in Africa. I think the other thing, the other point of change has been, how do you service clients? With what kind of channels do you service them with? And it's looking to that, the electronic, the mobile, the getting to the client base and where that base is with the kind of product and with the kind of channel that the client needs to be serviced with. The traditional way of servicing clients from a banking point of view isn't the way we think about it anymore. I mean, we've spoken about a lot of things today and about competitiveness in a lot of ways. One of the ways we need to think about competitiveness as well from an Africa point of view is innovation. So, it's education, of course it is, but the other side of it is also innovation. And if we really want to stay ahead of the curve, whether it's in banking or other parts of the business, it's innovation. And certainly as a bank, we're making lots of investments on the innovation side too.
So with Africa on the map internationally, or that radar screen internationally, we've certainly got ABSA and Barclays, one of the banks that's exploring that growth potential to leverage off the future trade and investment flows that we're anticipating to see from here on out. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our conversation this morning. It's where we're going to have to leave things. Thanks so much to you at home for joining us today, and thanks to our audience for your participation as well. Many thanks to our guests today, Michael Andrew, Chairman of KPMG International, Maria Ramos, CEO of ABSA, and of course, Chief Executive of Barclays Africa, Professor Nick Binedell, who's the founding director of the Gordon Institute of Business Science, and then to Tonya Cole, who's CEO of the Sahara Group, for joining us from our studios in Lagos, Nigeria as well. From me, Alishia Seckam, it's goodbye.